Okay, so welcome to this presentation on mostly about Jupiter and its transit for the remainder of this year. Recording this on the 12th of September, 2021 and into next year, and what I see coming for the next few months. Now, I see a lot happening in the next few months, a lot. So in a way, it's almost like this, it's just too much for my mind to actually grasp right now. And in another way, it's like this is a reason why I wanted to hone in on Jupiter more than anything, because without Jupiter, we're all a bit lost anyway. And the good news about that is that it will move into a stronger position next spring. But until then, we've got some challenging times ahead, I'm afraid to say. And although it might also be a bit of a mixed bag, and I'll explain why that is. And so there might be some good things coming out of a bad situation, as I keep referring to this transit of Jupiter in Capricorn, especially. This is the image of Gajendra here. I'm going to talk a lot about that myth and how it's playing out in real time, and sometimes in such real, like almost like you couldn't make it up kind of way, which I'll show you in this story about the elephants in India, or not in India, in China. If you hadn't heard that story already, I'll just go through that briefly as well, and how that's literally playing out in terms of how we feel about where we're going in life and looking for a sign or signal, you know, that everything is going to be okay. And that's what Jupiter is. It's about clarity, but it's also about hope. And so without hope, we really don't last very long. And that's why it feels quite dire right now, because Jupiter is about to step back into its sign of weakness in a couple of days on the 14th of September until the 20th of November. So I'll go through that again as well. But just to say that this is probably going to be quite challenging for a lot of people on the planet. Again, I don't know where and when this is going to hit, you know, individuals, because unless I'm looking at an individual chart, we can't say that. But for the world, we can say that generally this is a bit of a downturn. So when Jupiter goes into its weakest sign, you know, there is this lack of hope, but there's a lot of skepticism around. There's a lack of clarity and cohesion. There's a lack of order. And even though all of those things are what we're going to really want so badly, but we want them so badly because we don't have them. And that's the indication of Jupiter being in its weakest, looking at its exalted position across the zodiac in Cancer. So when planets go into their weakest, they desire the opposite. We all desire what's in front of us. And so when things get really bad, we want cohesion, we want clarity, we want togetherness, we want unity consciousness, if you want to put it that way. We want abundance, we want to feel cared for, we want to feel safe. And we want all of those things when it's not there. So Gajendra is a really poignant story, I think, about being lost in the mire and the mud of Capricorn, in the business of the day, in financial worries, and all our, you know, worldly concerns, and all the changes that are happening in the world right now with Capricorn so impacted. And at the same time, this image of Gajendra is he's holding up a flower and he's offering it to God. So I think there's a lot to be said about that image alone, but I'm going to go through that more in terms of, you know, where we're going forward with this and how we have to actually look within to get, in a way, out of this situation. I'm not saying globally, of course, there's a global phenomenon, but personally, individually, we all have to look within. And like that saying goes, the only way out is in. So anyway, that's Jupiter in a general sense for the next few months until, again, November 20th especially. But until it really makes it to Pisces by April, mid-April, when things really start shifting in a big way. And I think even in some instances, maybe even in catastrophic ways in the world, where it's almost like some things are going to divert our attention from other things, where it might be something quite big coming down, like where there's a big catastrophic event. And anyway, so we'll look at that as well. But it is at the same time a clearing, a sense of moving forward and, you know, breaking free and breaking, you know, beyond something. There's definitely a sense I get more than anything in April of things kind of being moved on, the story being moved on a lot. So anyway, let's go forward with this. Right. So I just wanted to, now this isn't me tooting my own horn, but I guess in a way it is, but I'm doing this very purposefully because I want to, if you're new to this or me, or if you're watching this maybe on a playback somewhere in the future, you might think, well, who's this guy? Who's he saying all of this? Like, how does he know anything? And of course, I just am an astrologer. I have been an astrologer for over 20 years. And I do get some things right. I don't always get the, you know, very specifics right, but I definitely think I called it in terms of what was happening, what I saw happening in around this time in 2020, especially. And especially in a couple of articles I wrote. And so I'm just going to direct your attention to those if you want to read those again. And the reason I do that is actually to show you that actually, when I do get in tune with what's happening, what I see happening in the future, it's kind of like giving, I guess, me a backup, because it also, like any reader, when you get it right, you are given a confidence boost, and that actually facilitates getting it right more. Basically. So I wrote about in this article, Crossing the Divide, Jupiter's transits for those few years. By 2020, old ways begin to break down as we discover new ways to move forward in the following years. We may struggle with what emerges initially as powerful planetary conjunctions recalibrate structures and belief systems around the globe, and we are each asked to change our lives in response to changes. Mass upheavals on the planet are likely, but people will eventually wake to a new truth, as new voices rise up, faintly at first, but eventually becoming loud and clear. Now, this whole thing about, and I wrote that in 2018, so I could see this coming in that sense. So again, the reason I'm pointing this out is that I might not be able to say exactly what's going to happen over the next few months, but I could see it's going to be quite chaotic. So kind of trust me on that. But what we're living in, as many commentators are saying now, is that we're living in this post-truth era. And that was all to do with Sagittarius, of course, but of course, it's the continuing story of Jupiter, which rules Sagittarius in this really mired situation. Where is the truth? Nobody knows the truth. Nobody knows what to do. There's a lack of clarity about anything. And that's what's coming back in April. So that alone is maybe enough to take us out of the swamp, you know, to take us out of that kind of darkness. So that's positive. Okay, whatever else is going to happen in the next few months, because there's going to be a lot of very volatile situations, at least there's that sense of clarity coming next spring and April especially. This was another article, and I think this was my best article that I've written, was in the 2020 magazine. So I wrote this in 2019, called "The Truth Is Out There," because of course we were already using that phrase post-truth. Pluto, Saturn, and Jupiter in Capricorn. So I just took this from the article. We are likely to see more and more catastrophic events, increasing a sense of doom as Saturn and Pluto get closer together in the beginning of 2020 and throughout the year that follows. Now, I could have actually wrote that as the years that follow, as opposed to the year that follows, but I'm usually only ever looking at the year ahead. And I start looking at the year ahead more and more as we get into the autumn. So I'm really looking at 22 now a lot. And I do that very specifically for the reason that I don't think it's good to look too far out for my own personal well-being, my own mental health. And also, it's it's like a weather forecast. It's, you know how weather forecasters only really get it right when they're just a few days out. And if they try to go further out than that, they'll get it wrong. It's kind of the same with astrology. So anyway, we will likely see this play out in big corporations attempting to take more and more power, while we as individuals do our part to give it to them, while simultaneously seeking to take our power back. Borders are compromised and simultaneously tightened by nations and individuals. So that is what I saw more than anything going on in 2020, but I didn't know it was going to be a pandemic and lockdowns. I just saw that everybody was going to be dealing with their own stuff in their own bubble. That's what I had envisaged. So anyway, this conjunction brings with it themes of destruction, protection, extinction, survival, decay, recuperation, endings, beginnings, although some experience this more intensely based on individual circumstances as seen in the chart. So basically, and your cycles, which are called dashas in Indian astrology, planetary cycles. So obviously, this is not going to impact everybody the same, you know, and that's what I really want to put out there and emphasize, that this is a general forecast, remember. So anyway, that's something I wanted to say there. And if you wanted to read this article, you can just go to the website. It's here. The truth is out there. I mean, that's a few years old now, but again, it's still highlighting what is going on currently and what has been happening historically with Saturn, Pluto as well, and so on. So anyway, that's that. Let's move it on. One thing I got a sense of more than anything while researching this is that basically when we're in the murk and we can't see a way out and we're struggling, we look for any kind of sign at all. And I think this is what we need more than anything. So, you know, we look to the heavens, you know, so just give me a sign, whatever it might be. And so at its strongest, you know, in Cancer, which, you know, many would say that when Jupiter is in Capricorn retrograde, especially until mid-October, it cancels its cancellation. But in fact, I would say that it doesn't cancel it, it mitigates it. And it's oftentimes as well said that when Jupiter or any planet is retrograde in its debilitated sign, it's like it's behaving as if it's exalted, like it's in the opposite sign. But you get a mixed bag, basically. You get a bit of both. So how we saw that play out, of course, and we've already been through this many times. This is the third time, by the way, of Jupiter in Capricorn. The first time it moved in was March in 2020. Is these kind of packages governments are paying out in keeping everything afloat. So that's like a good way of how this has expressed itself in a very obvious way, where there's a downturn because it's Jupiter, it's the economy, the expansion and growth has taken a dip. And every time it goes into Capricorn, there has been a dip. Last time it was in Capricorn was 2008. I'm going to show you the cycles of that as well, and how when Jupiter made it out of Capricorn and into Pisces back then in 2010, 2011, that period, the recession officially ended. Well, you know, in the UK at any rate. So there is this sense of buoyancy more so next year. But this Jupiter in Capricorn has been a long slog because it moved in March 2020, and it usually only stays a year in the sign, but it's been dragged out over almost nearly 2 years because it's not going to make it out until the end of November this year. So since the beginning of last year and until the end of this year, for most of that time, it's been pretty dire. But like I said, because Saturn is there, that's a mitigating factor. And because it's retrograde, it's also a mitigating factor. So it actually helps it out and contains the problem in many ways. And how do you contain a problem? With Saturn present, you lock down. That's how everything's been contained. Now, unfortunately, it's also been restrained, and it's, you know, showed that side of it. So anyone who says to you that Jupiter retrograde conjunct Saturn in Capricorn is like it's exalted, well, that's obviously not the case, because there's been challenges, you know, the world over in the last nearly 2 years. But what it does do, again, is it mitigates it. So instead of saying cancellation of debilitation, mitigation is probably a better phrase. And the other really complicated aspect of this is that Pluto is in Capricorn as well. So that makes it all even more confusing, complicated, and dire. And Pluto is the god of death, the lord of the underworld, he's called in modern astrology. So that is also increasing problems. And one of those problems, and likely again, you know, as it moves back into Capricorn now from mid-September until the end of November, is another wave of the virus, unfortunately, and possibly also even more and more variants. So I really don't like saying that, but, you know, I can't see any other way that this could express itself. And if there wasn't a virus around, I would be predicting, and I probably still will be predicting, attacks. So it's either a virus or it's a terrorist attack, because that's what the nodes have instigated in this whole, you know, thing. So the other thing about that is that Pluto is said to, in modern astrology, rule Scorpio, which the south node, Ketu, also rules. And that relates to disease, virus, death, you know, all the light goody stuff in life, right? Scorpio. So we're having a lot of kind of Scorpio kind of themes playing out right now. And so again, this is why this image of Gajendra crying, offering up a flower, you know, is apt. And of course, this is the cure. And one good thing I could say that would be happening, and actually even into next month, is that Rahu, the north node of the moon, so the south node Ketu is in Scorpio right now, and it's really emphasizing this need to get over this problem, but it's also emphasizing variance and all of that. Rahu has been in Taurus, and it's been in this lunar mansion called Rohini, and this is very much about luxuries and pleasures, and the economy and all of that is being affected by that. But previous to that, it was in Mrigashirsha, which is ruled by the god Soma, the cure. And so the fact that Rahu is moving on now is also a better situation in many ways. And although they don't move out of Taurus and Scorpio until April, and I'll show you that in April, it's very interesting how on the same day the nodes move out of Taurus and Scorpio, Jupiter moves into Pisces. So there's something big happening in mid-April that really moves things forward. But my point here is that the North Node in Taurus is affecting, of course, getting the drugs out, getting the vaccines out, you know, getting the cure out, and all the like, oh, I mean, I shouldn't even go down this rabbit hole of, you know, Rahu is anything that's hidden, that's a bit, and Ketu, both are, they're shadows, they're eclipses, the north and south node of the moon. In the signs of Taurus and Scorpio throughout history have also shown issues around famines and things like that, and supply chains and all of that are being affected right now, as we can see, and we're seeing also famines. But Rahu in Taurus especially is, in terms of the economy, the unreal situation that's going on with the markets, as opposed to what's happening on the ground. So this is kind of an unreal situation, but also to do with the cure and treatments. It's like it's almost like rationality has been chucked out the window at this point, basically, and there seems to be very little debate, or, you know, there's just no space for it. There's just absolutely no space for an actual rational discussion about science and treatments and so on. But anyway, that's a whole other topic. I can easily go down a rabbit hole there. For anyone that's here live, of course, please feel free to have a discussion about this afterwards. I've got lots of astrology to relay to you around that. But anyway, this story, which is fascinating to me, and it kind of puts it all in context of this herd of elephants in China, really got me thinking, and that's the reason I started to do this, these slides for this presentation at this time. And it's the story of this herd of elephants, and I'll bring it up here on BBC. There and Back Again is the title of this. So this was written on the 16th of August. So basically, this herd of elephants, I hope you can see that, but even if you can, I mean, I'll just read it a little bit out to you. For the past 17 months have been wandering China. So you might have heard of this. They set out around March last year. Now, again, you cannot make this up. A herd of elephants, as soon as Jupiter moves into Capricorn, into its weakest place, left their shire and moved out and on and started rampaging through China. And there's a lot of like different theories about why they did this. It's not quite sure. That maybe they were thinking their habitat was getting smaller and they were feeling they needed to move out. That's the main theory, I guess. But there's also other theories here which are really interesting. I want to show you here. So they've caused so much damage on this rampage through China, and they've had to kind of herd them back, trying to kind of coerce them back, and they're actually heading back now, which is what's also fascinating, the fact that they're heading back now as Jupiter is going retrograde back into Capricorn. This herd of elephants are heading back. And the fact that also Jupiter was in Aquarius, you know, that sense of kind of breaking out of the norm and all of that. I mean, I could go on and on about just one story alone for the next hour, but I just wanted to highlight the main theme. So there's a lot of different opinions, but one opinion that was expressed in this article, which I thought was fascinating, was that it was the opinion that the leader of the herd led them astray, which is fascinating, like that, whether that's true or not. But the fact that this is reported, it's like, it's just interesting in terms of the mythology and all of that, and the herd of elephants being led astray by its leader. And again, this is Jupiter in Capricorn. And it's like, we don't know what's going on, and we're kind of all led astray. And let's talk about China while we're on the subject, because now, again, I have to be really mindful of how I'm conveying all of this. Of course, I realize that. But this is China's chart. I'll bring it up here. And you can see here that it has Capricorn rising, 8 degrees, with the moon very closely conjunct the ascendant. So it is being very impacted by these transits, because this is where Jupiter moved in. You can see here it has Jupiter at 29 degrees. So around March last year, Jupiter was at this degree and then moved into Capricorn, into its weakest place. And what did China do? I mean, what China did was, and you might say it's right or wrong, everybody has an opinion, of course, but in terms of the astrology I'm talking about, it basically, you could think about it, this is where it began, right? So this is important because how they reacted to the virus dictated how the rest of the world followed suit. So whatever you want to think about the policies that were put in place subsequently, you can really say that it began in China and that they followed suit. Now, if you remember the images that were going on, that were coming out of China at the time, of streets being sprayed down, like literally streets being sprayed down, you know, think about it for a minute, or people being welded into their homes, you know, these kinds of things that were happening. So what kind of signal was that sending out to the world, in other words? And that's a very Jupiter and Capricorn fear-based signal that the world has basically taken and ran with. So one other thing I wanted to point out is that in the cycles, they have just started this Mercury cycle at the end of 2019, just so happens, at the end of 2019. So what's Mercury to them? Well, Mercury is the 6th lord that represents illnesses, and it's in the 9th house retrograde. And 9th house, of course, is, you know, trade or travel and all of that, and it links with trade and all of that. But it's conjunct Ketu, the south node, which rules viruses, and that's the cycle that has started, a sub-cycle that started March this year. So that's one thing. So there's ongoing issues there. But in this sign-based cycle, you can see here they've been in Gemini for a few years, since actually 2017, actually. I don't have it here on screen, but it's 2017 that began. Interestingly, in October, so just next month, they start a Taurus cycle. So they're moving from a 6th house cycle, which is all about illness, to a 5th house cycle. So that's much better. So this is much better for China. And the reason I'm bringing up this is that, you know, if it started here, we can look at their chart. What's going on there is going to have a big impact as well. But in terms of the world now, because it's obviously spread globally, we can look at the announcement of the pandemic. Now, again, this is maybe not too exact because there's many charts I guess you could use, but because we don't know when it broke out really, it's the WHO and their announcement of the pandemic that I'm using here as a chart. And you can of course see that there's a lineup here. And I'm going to show you this again because actually, no, I'll just refer to it now here, that I don't know if you have watched the flurry of 9/11 documentaries and movies online. It seems to be they're just releasing loads and loads. It was the anniversary just yesterday, the 20th anniversary of 9/11. There was a similar lineup going on at that time. And that's when Rahu and Ketu are in these particular signs, Gemini and Sagittarius, but more specifically Ardra and Mula, the god and goddess of death, you could call them. And so it always brings a lot of death. In 9/11, of course, it brought death very quickly, but for the pandemic, which this is the pandemic here, it's kind of slow. And so Jupiter was with Rahu for 9/11, but here it was with Ketu, and Ketu specifically rules viruses. And Mars as well. So it's the same lineup with Ketu, Mars here, and Rahu in Gemini. This was the same as 9/11, except that Jupiter was with Rahu, and this time round it's with Ketu. So, and then they subsequently went in and met with Saturn and Pluto, which is another layer of it. But anyway, this was, you know, the whole timing of the beginning of the pandemic. So where to from here, basically? What now? What now? That's what we're all asking, I guess, because we need to move on from this. I just wanted to set the scene. But this is the god Vishnu in a reclining position, and this is very much about listening to sense in a very practical way as well, when you think about it. And Vishnu is the lord of sustenance, of, you know, harmony and balance, and returning the world to harmony and balance. But it's not really able to do its job, shall I say, until Saturn moves out. And Saturn will move out in the new year as well, of this sign that Vishnu rules. So that's something to be mindful of. So Vishnu is related to 10 different avatars, and 9 of them relate to the 9 grahas or planets of Indian astrology. And there's a 10th one that is seen as almost like, you know, the predicted Kalki. So Kalki, this is the figure here of Kalki on a white horse. Now, this, of course, relates to the whole thing of knight in shining armor and all of that, and they're coming in on a white horse. And I'm going to be talking a lot more about this white horse and Pegasus as we move forward into Pisces. But there's this, you know, sense of, you know, Vishnu being about returning the universe to harmony. But Jupiter, which in terms of Vishnu's avatar is related to this Vamana deity. And this is Vamana here. And it's this Brahmin boy. So what the hell has that got to do with anything? Well, my one thought about this, because if you read the story about Vamana and how he restored harmony to the universe by taking back the universe and disharmony from a demon, by, you know, he disguised himself, he's Vishnu, but he was like a little boy, and he asked for 3 footsteps. And this is why the sign Shravana, where Saturn is currently placed in Capricorn, is symbolized by 3 footsteps. It's this sense of taking back or restoring harmony. So he was a little boy, but then he grew massive, and then he placed 1 foot over the world, and then 1 foot over the heavens, and then his last foot over the head of this demon who bowed down to him. So there's lots of ways I'm sure you could read this into this myth. One thing I thought about it was perhaps, just perhaps, there's a restoration of harmony through some unexpected means. That's one thing, that's one thought I had, that there could be some thing that we hadn't accounted for, something small even that just comes up and grows and grows and grows, and that's going to be this, how are we going to get out of this? So just put that on the back burner for now. So that's Vamana. So Jupiter in its debilitation sign is sleeping. There's this notion in Vedic thought that there are 3 impulses that are basically underpinning everything we experience, whatever it be, a thought, a feeling, a sensation, whatever it is, there are 3 things. And there's a sleeping state, a dreaming state, and an awake state. And these are all reflected in the symbol of Om. Looks like a 3 and the dot over it, which is the dot is the pure spirit, which is beyond all of these 3. But these 3 express themselves in the planets too. And so when Jupiter now returns back to Capricorn, it's going back into a sleeping state until the end of November. Again, although mitigated, and there are things that are helping that out, it's almost like, yeah, you're back into a sleeping state, but you're like taking lots of coffee to try and perk yourself up, perhaps, you know, whatever it is. But it is going back to sleep. When it goes into Aquarius, where it's been for the last few months, it's in a dreaming state. It's in a neutral sign. It's neutral to Saturn in that sense. So it won't be until it makes it to its own sign, Pisces, by the 13th of April next year that it wakes up. And again, if you got nothing else from this presentation today, the sense that by next April, trust, have faith that people will wake up, that you will wake up as an individual, that the world will wake up, that leaders will wake up, that things will start to sort of get clear about what needs to happen and start to move forward in more productive ways in the years subsequent. So that's the more positive expression. Now let's get to the not so positive. So I always like playing with words. So here's like, what now? But now what? And now what is the other side of Jupiter moving into Pisces next year? And that is conjunct Neptune, by the way. That is floods galore. Lots and lots of floods, like, and possibly also major catastrophic floods, like beyond what we've already seen this year. This quote I really like. It reminds me more than anything about the significance of astrology and transits. Why do we look at transits at all? Why are we focusing on cycles, planets? You know, it's about understanding that everything gives way to something else. Wherever you are in your life right now, however you're feeling, it changes. And so that's always good to remind yourself. But this, I think, is really apt. So an insoluble problem is seldom solved on its own terms. Rather, it loses its urgency through the dawning of a new way of life. And so until we get to that new way of life, like I said, from April, it's going to be a bit of a struggle, because you're just trying to solve a problem with another problem and another problem and another problem. And, you know, and Pisces is about seeing things differently. And it's actually about having faith even when you cannot see things. And it's very, like, when you think about Einstein, who had a lot of planets in Pisces, including Mercury, he was that kind of thinker. You know, he realized you have to think differently about problems, and it's not just about trying to figure out problems with more problems. So Jupiter in Aquarius, which is the kind of interim transit really in amongst all of this, in the kind of downturn of Jupiter in Capricorn at its weakest, and the upturn of Jupiter in Pisces in its own sign, complicated by some factors for sure, but still an upturn. You have this interim twilight phase of Jupiter in Aquarius, because it's neutral. It's, even though it's celebrated as Kumbh Mela in India, because it's just because Jupiter's moved out of its weakest. It's not really strong yet, really. And because it's a neutral relationship to Saturn. So it's a more complicated situation, put it that way. So it's been in already, it's from April 5th, and it will move out on 14th of September. So in 2 days' time. And then it will return to Aquarius on November 20th until April 13th next year, when it moves into Pisces. So we've got another few months of it over the winter. And it is still a better situation. Now, this is what I predicted before, but like, it is definitely still a better situation than in Capricorn. So what may happen is that the autumn time is a bit of a downturn, a bit of a downer, maybe more waves and all of that. But even without a wave, it's a downturn. Morale will be low. The economy will be struggling. There'll be more incentives and all of that. There'll be more payouts, and there'll be more things struggling, but trying to get open and all of that. But in Aquarius, there are more possibilities for thinking outside the box, also thinking about things differently, trying to solve problems and all of that. It's just, it's not as clear, let me put it that way, as is in Pisces. So this is the article here on the website if you want to read about it. Jupiter in Aquarius, freedom seekers. And actually a few of my patrons, maybe one or two of you are present here, I don't know, who wrote, there was about 3 people who wrote a piece for this article. I put it out there as a kind of like group tank kind of thing, think tank. And it was like, what do you think Jupiter in Aquarius is all about? So it's a nice kind of group activity, which is what Aquarius is all about. It's all about groups and communities and society and people coming together, banding together and trying to solve problems on their own, not waiting for government to sort it out, which is Leo. Aquarius is very much about the people. So Jupiter is currently in Dhanishta. It's this lunar mansion here, and it's quite a long time in Dhanishta because it's retrograde back and forth. So it started there in March, and then May of this year, and then again went back in July 25th, and it will remain in Dhanishta because it's retrograde, stopping and going back forward again until January 2nd next year. Then it will go into Shat-Bishak or Shat-Bishaj, whichever way you want to pronounce it. This is 100 healers. So this January to March time is interesting because it's leading to this time where Jupiter goes into Pisces. So it could be that there are a lot of advancements here in terms of treatment. It could be, again, booster shots and all of that stuff going on, but it could be treatments also. or advancements in the vaccine. Who knows? But there's definitely some advancements going on in the new year. So that's also bringing us to a more hopeful situation. So then when it gets into Pisces, so it moves into Pisces from April 13th next year until April 21st the following year. So it's pretty more a straightforward transit now, whereas in Capricorn, it was in and out, and it really dragged it out over 2 years and really dragged out the situation we're in a very dire way. In Pisces, it's just clearly 1 year. And that's what Jupiter normally does in a sign, just 1 year. So there are different phases within this. And the main phase will be when it's in this one here. So it's only a couple of months in Purva Bhadrapada. That bridges Aquarius and Pisces. So it's just a couple of months in here. And it's only a couple of months in the last lunar mansion in Pisces, Revati, February, April of 2023. So most of the time from April 22 to February 23, it's in this one called Uttara Bhadrapada. And one of the symbols of this sign, this literally means ladder, auspicious steps, is that it's this mystery and depth of Pisces. And I have this image here of, the very unusual creatures that live very deep in the ocean that luminesce and they create their own light source. And that's very much like this sign, Uttara Bhadrapada. And that's what Pisces is very much like. They're very sort of what would be the word? I don't want to say self-sufficient, but I want to say like a luminescent kind of creature down in the deep. They're able to create their own light. So it's about going within, creating your own sense of light and clarity within yourself, basically. That's another way of saying, look within, the only way out is in, basically. The only way out of this situation is to go within. And that's not even actually a kind of cliched sort of spiritual like lament. It's not. It's actually a practical step in getting out of this situation. So anyway, that's Jupiter and Pisces. So the 3 lunar mansions I'll mention again here in Aquarius, moving from Aquarius to Pisces, are Purva and Uttara, the former, and the latter, Bhadra. Bhadra means auspicious. And actually, this is the lunar month of Bhadrapada as well in the Hindu calendar. So it's not seen as auspicious time. But this auspiciousness doesn't mean that it's all easy, that it's all roses. Absolutely not. Especially this first one, Purva Bhadrapada, is likened to a lightning bolt. It's a very severe, what's called a fierce lunar mansion. And one of the symbols is a lightning bolt, and it's tied to Pegasus. So here, these are the constellations where this is involved. Of course, you can see Aquarius moving to Pisces, but here you can see this is the constellation of Pegasus. And so I'm going to talk more about this anyway, but we're in this transition now, and this has so much to say about, all of the myths around flooding and end of times and, end of an era really is what I would see it as more than anything. And it's the end of an age, basically. We're moving from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius, and this is the sign that helps us get there. Purva Bhadrapada. It moves from 20 degrees Aquarius to 3 degrees of Pisces. So it bridges both Aquarius and Pisces. And like I said, it's a very fierce dynamic. It's ruled by a form of Shiva, which is like god of destruction. So it's one of the symbols is a sword, so there is death involved as well here, even though it's called auspicious. The auspiciousness it refers to is actually spirituality and ridding ourselves of anything that's not our true nature, basically. So these are seen as a pair, Purva and Uttara Bhadrapada, and they are seen as 2 halves of a funeral pyre or a funeral cot. So it's not like auspicious in that kind of worldly sense. It's auspicious in the spiritual sense. So Purva means former. It is ruled by a fierce former Shiva. I mentioned that. It is symbolized by a man with 2 faces also. And that also is symbolic of looking at the truth and seeing fact from being able to tell fact from fiction. So this is another, again, transition that we're going through with Jupiter moving in here, remember, from March next year, actually February, March. Is that what I said? February, March? March, April next year. So this is another transition going on there. Then Uttara Bhadrapada, this is a virtuous one. and it shows a step further towards enlightenment and into the depths more of Pisces. If you know anyone who's Pisces, like rising sign, moon sign, or a lot of planets, you know they have a great depth to them, and they have to take a lot of care of themselves because they take on everybody's issues. They're like a sponge. So that's the nature of Pisces. And the great thing about when Jupiter moves in here is that we have a sense of connection more again. And that's also another more positive indication for next spring onwards and for the following year. Just getting connected again, you know. You could almost cry at the thought of it. So anyway, that's Uttara Bhadrapada. And then the last lunar mansion from 16 to 30 degrees of Pisces, the very end of the zodiac, as Jupiter will move through here into the beginning of 2023, in April 2023, it'll finish here. I think it's going to be quite an explosive finishing, to be honest, but we can get into that later on. But Revati means abundant, a sign representing material and spiritual nourishment, is ruled by the guardian of the living and the dead. So Pushyan is the deity here, and he's like a shepherd deity, and it's very related to Jesus Christ. And so this is why, of course, Revati and Jesus Christ and all these symbols came in the age of Pisces. But remember, we are now going back from Revati back to, you know, the latter auspicious steps, and eventually back to the former auspicious steps, which is a lot more fierce. The latter Uttara Bhadrapada is actually a very fixed sign. So there's a lot of stability about that. But when you then transition to the Purva, it's very fierce and creates a lot of change and a lot of destruction as well. And so you basically, if you want to just read the Bible, or Book of Revelations, it's basically telling you the story of these signs, how it moves back. And don't think about it the end of the world. Think about it as the end of an age, the end of the age of Pisces into the age of Aquarius. I'm going to do a whole other presentation on the age of Aquarius because I'm writing an article on that right now, but I won't waste time on it here right now. One last thing. Okay, I was debating whether I should put this image up, but I think it might feel like this at times over the next while. I don't think I need to say any more about that. Another thing I wanted to point out to you, which is fascinating to me, I've been reading this and looking into this whole concept of Noah's Ark, and actually Noah's Ark being something in the stars. So this is from Deseret News. You can look up the article here. An archaeologist unearths Noah in the stars. Yutan finding a picture story. So I can click on here and show you the article itself. It is archaeologist unearths Noah in stars. Yutan finding picture story of flood ark in ancient constellations. So basically, it's the constellation of Pegasus I was referring to, and the flood waters and flooding. And it's the whole symbolism of Noah's Ark and the end of the world, and all of that is related to these signs that I've been referring to. So it's all about these signs, Purva and Uttara Bhadrapada. It's this here. This is Pegasus here. And because it's got like 4 stars and it's this shape of an ark. This is actually the ark, but it's actually a horse. So anyway, let me move forward again. If you have questions, please feel free to ask your questions. You might have a lot of questions. So this is Pegasus again. So Pegasus was a son of Neptune and Medusa. So that is very interesting. The fact that Neptune is linked to Pisces in the modern astrology era, and Medusa links to Rahu, the north node of the moon, which links to Aquarius. Anyway, Pegasus, again, spans both Aquarius and Pisces. So Pegasus was the son of Neptune and Medusa, sprung by his father's command from the blood of the latter, which dropped into the sea after her head had been severed by Perseus. So Pegasus was the thundering horse of Jove that carried the divine lightning. So this is Pegasus. And there's a big link between, obviously, Purva Bhadrapada and Uttara Bhadrapada. This is the constellation of Pegasus. But especially this Purva Bhadrapada, there's this symbol of lightning attached to it. And Shiva is the deity in the Hindu pantheon. So it's like this kind of fierceness and this clarity and it cutting through the murk and getting clear. And this is what I'm talking about. Jupiter is moving through this sign in the new year, March, April, and it's cutting through all the whatever, and then getting clear, basically. So moving on, but to move on, we need to move back. These are things, some things, I mean, the last few days I was just picking out some news stories that related to Jupiter in Aquarius and Pisces, in particular. And so the last time it was in Aquarius Pisces was 2010 and 11. And okay, maybe I was thinking maybe I shouldn't put this in because we're in a very different dynamic right now with the current pandemic, but there was a pandemic in 2009 and it ended in 2010. So this influenza pandemic, you might have forgotten about that. You know, we have other pandemics, you know. So the WHO actually declared that it was over. So it began with Jupiter conjunct Rahu in Capricorn. Hello? And then it ended when Jupiter entered Pisces. So that's, again, I don't want to give you false hope, but at the same time, that sounds promising. Now, there's a lot more that's going on this time that wasn't going on then. And you might say that it was just like nothing in comparison to what's going on now in terms of pandemic, but, you know, it is at least a sense of some light at the end of the tunnel here. The other thing, of course, that happened when Jupiter was in Capricorn is that there was a recession, you know, the crash, right? Jupiter is the economy, its expansion, its growth. It takes a nosedive when it goes into Capricorn. So there was a recession, but in the UK, the recession was declared over by, I don't know who, as soon as Jupiter moved into Pisces. But other things happened, like the Japan earthquake. Do you remember that one? And the tsunami and the power plant, all of that disaster, right? So that was Jupiter in Aquarius. And so that was a complete and utter disaster, right? WikiLeaks, that was another thing that happened during Jupiter in Pisces. The BP oil spill, if you remember that one in the Gulf of Mexico, that was a huge disaster. I mean, the reason I'm bringing up this is because Jupiter isn't everything good. It just expands on a theme. And sometimes it expands things you don't want to expand, like an oil leak. So the BP oil spill began with Jupiter conjunct Neptune. And I'm mentioning that very specifically because we're having this again. Ended with Jupiter conjunct Uranus in Pisces. So as soon as it conjunct Uranus, then it ended. This leak went on for like months. And then just another thing I pulled out was the flash crash, they call it. Jupiter entered Pisces conjunct Uranus. So at the same time as this oil spill was dealt with, this happened. And it was very sudden, but very short-lived. It's kind of like Jupiter had just entered Pisces, but also had then conjoined Uranus, which is quite explosive and shocking and surprising and quick. And so it's not like that this time because Uranus is now in Aries. But what's happening this time is that Jupiter is entering Pisces and conjoining Neptune. So floods, floods, floods is what I'm seeing. Okay, another thing that happened, which I found fascinating, was, again, if you watch recent documentaries on 9/11 or anything on the news, again, you cannot make this up. They called it Operation Neptune Spear. So this is when they killed Osama bin Laden, allegedly. So you can look it up yourself. But basically, on the 2nd of May in Pakistan, this was the chart. And what was happening at the time? Mars was exactly conjunct Jupiter at the very end, coming to the last degree of Pisces. This is a tricky juncture. And again, we're going to go into it by April 2023. But it's also like a clearing and an ending and a new beginning. So by April 2023, whatever we're going through in Pisces and whatever we're clearing out, because it's literally going to be like a clear out, and flooding and all of that would be part of that. Literally as well as figuratively, there's sense of endings and lots of endings before we can start again. And the fact that they say they killed Osama bin Laden on this date is highly symbolic. So other things to be mindful of is that if we go way back in history, we have the 1919 hurricane in the Gulf Coast. So here, hurricane tide 16 feet above normal rise. Like this, I think this was Corpus Christi, I think where it was hit more. But anyway, look at the chart and look at what we're experiencing next year, something similar. So this was directly after the Spanish flu. So the Spanish flu was when Rahu and Ketu were in these signs, Gemini and Sagittarius, where they create havoc, and then they went into Taurus and Scorpio. Now they're the opposite way around right now. So Rahu is here, Ketu is here. But what we also had back then was that Jupiter and Pluto were together, which was the Spanish flu. And then Jupiter went into an exaltation and conjoined Neptune, and then Mars came into the picture. And then there was this hurricane and massive floods. So we're going to have this in the new year. So obviously I put a question mark because I don't know what's going to happen. But will we have floods in April? Well, you might say we're always having floods. I'm talking about catastrophic floods because Jupiter and Neptune, I'm just showing the chart in April of Jupiter Neptune conjunct. It doesn't have to happen exactly then, but Mars is coming up behind them. And then subsequently, like I said, on the 13th of April, Jupiter will move into Pisces, and then Neptune will move in a week later or a few days after. And then Mars will move in. So it definitely has the potential, April, May next year, of massive flooding. Along with all the other positive things I was talking about, I hope you don't forget those. The clearing, the sense of new hope and clarity, and okay, this is what we got to do now. Let's get some sanity into the picture here, all of that. This is a quote from one of my favorite poems. It's Anything Can Happen by Seamus Heaney. You know how Jupiter will mostly wait for clouds to gather head before he hurls the lightning? Well, just now he galloped his thunder cart and his horses across a clear blue sky. So this, for me, more than anything, tells us the story and the transition from Aquarius to Pisces, from Jupiter's weakness to its strength, and in the cycles in Indian astrology of Rahu to Jupiter. And Jupiter always follows Rahu in the cycles because clarity always follows confusion. And you cannot have clarity without confusion, in fact. So whatever's been happening, we have to remind ourselves that this is the 14th of April next year. This is when this is the day the sun moves into Aries. So not only are we having Jupiter move into Pisces, strong, we're having the sun move into Aries, strong. And we have the nodes move out of Taurus and Scorpio. So Rahu moves into Aries, Ketu moves into Libra. So there's so much happening on that one day in the space of 24 hours that for something not to occur, I would be just blown away if something didn't happen. Whether it's symbolic or not, something has to symbolically happen somewhere for this sense of, and even just for yourself personally, to see this date as, and this whole period in April as a transition. So there's something breaking free here. I said breaking bonds as well, because of course we have Ketu here, and we can get into that. If you have questions, please feel free to ask, but Ketu is in Libra and then aspected by Saturn. So there's some bonds we're breaking, some agreements we're going to have to break, basically, to get out of this. So then looking long-term, but I don't want to look too long-term. As I said, I don't like to look too far ahead, like a year maybe, but if you have any questions, of course, please feel free to ask. Rahu will be in Aries, as I said, Ketu and Libra for the following year and a half, and it's starting again. There's definitely more warlike kind of themes going on through this whole period because Rahu in Aries. Ketu and Libra then, like again, breaking promises, breaking contracts, breaking relationships. And in terms of globally, that could be countries breaking apart, or it could literally be warlike situations. And then looking further ahead into the following year, 2023, Jupiter will join Rahu in Aries. And not just Rahu, but Uranus. Jupiter, Rahu, Uranus in Aries is quite volatile. So that's from May 20, that's the exact conjunction is May 2023, but it moves in April 23. And I do think that there's going to be quite a, well, it's almost like, well, whatever gets cleared out now, it's kind of like this literally going to be placed by other issues and problems. And, what's happened recently in Afghanistan and all these things. I mean, you have to read that in context and say that, there's going to be some issues here. And then Rahu will be in Ashwini, which is Ketu sign, and Ketu will be in Swati, which is Rahu sign. So they're in each other's signs, and it creates this, every time they go into each other's signs, it creates some issues, some complex issues that the world has to deal with. So that's further afield. I don't want to bog you down too much. So I'm going to leave it there for now. And I'll pass it over to you. So if you have any questions, if you are watching a playback, then you can email me if you'd like if you have any questions. any comments. I'd love to hear from you. Any comments you have. info@timelineastrology.com. So for those who are here live, please think about questions. For those who are watching playback, please think about becoming a patron. If you're not a patron already, you can go to timelineastrology.com or patreon.com/timelineastrology. And that's it for now. And I wish you all the very best with this Jupiter transition, a massive transition in our lives, all our lives. And I hope that the change and transition works out in the best possible way for you. Okay, until next time.